Good afternoon. My name is Joel Tickner, and I'm the Director of the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar of our Retailer and Green Chemistry Education webinar series entitled Training and Incentivizing Merchants to Purchase Sustainable Products, Three Perspectives. For today's webinar, the topic is purchasing. And as we know, purchasers have enormous powers in driving the marketplace for more sustainable products. Yet purchasers have many competing demands, primarily price and performance, and are not experts in chemistry. So for today's webinar, we're going to explore the question of how can purchasers ask better questions and be more integrally involved in supporting the design and adoption of green chemistry alternatives. For our webinar today, we have three speakers coming at the question of green chemistry and purchasing from different perspectives. We have Jason Pearson, the Executive Director of the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. Jason is CEO and President of SPLC, a nonprofit organization that supports and recognizes purchasing leadership that accelerates the transition to a prosperous and sustainable future. The Council convened a diverse membership to create a shared program for guiding, measuring, and recognizing leadership in sustainable purchasing. Rob Kaplan is the Sustainability Director at Walmart, and in that position, Rob drives product and supply chain innovation by integrating sustainability and business strategy. He leads sustainability strategy and implementation for the consumables and health and wellness business, including categories such as personal care, household chemicals, and over-the-counter. In addition, he is responsible for customer engagement, packaging, and the Closed Loop Fund. And Larry Garcia is a Senior Environmental Analyst for Seattle City Light. Larry coordinates the chemical approval and alternatives assessment, green purchasing, recycling, and pollution prevention and integrated pest management programs. And with that, let me introduce Jason Pearson.
Great. Thank you very much, Joel. Thank you for the opportunity to present. It's a real pleasure to present with Rob and Larry today. I'm going to spend the few minutes that I have with you just giving you an overview of what the Sustainable Purchasing Council is and what we are doing as a background for the conversation that we're having today. And I assume that if there are questions, that those can come in through in the Q&A period, and we can answer those. If we don't have time to answer all the questions that you have, I'd be happy to respond to questions after the presentation. Joel described briefly what the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council is. We are focused on institutional purchasing. By institutional purchasing, we mean purchasing of finished goods and services by government and business-to-consumer service providers. So we're talking about purchasing of goods and services by federal, state, and local government, and purchases of goods and services by universities, schools, hotels, hospitals, financial institutions, airlines, all the other types of organizations that provide services to consumers. We have not prioritized guidance for retailers since we see other initiatives in the marketplace that are specifically targeted to retailers, and we would prefer to coordinate with those existing initiatives to find alignment, and that is exactly what we're doing. We estimate that institutional purchasing, as we define it, in the U.S. alone, represents $10 trillion in economic demand. This economic demand is the engine that drives the U.S. economy. It drives 70% of U.S. employment, and it enables the delivery of many of the goods and services that make possible our high quality of life. But it also drives an industrial economy that results in unfortunate, unintended negative consequences. That same $10 trillion in institutional purchasing demand drives an estimated 2/3 of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, which is approximately 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That same $10 trillion in demand drives a range of other environmental and social impacts. So leadership organizations, the types of organizations that have come together in the Council, recognize that their economic demand is the initial economic signal that leads to these consequences, and they understand the supply chain risks that these impacts represent, so they are seeking to take responsibility for these risks in a meaningful way. For example, the General Services Administration, arguably the largest institutional purchaser in the world, has estimated that their acquisition of goods and services, or the federal government's acquisition of goods and services, creates a carbon footprint 9 times that of their buildings and fleet put together. Institutional purchasers have a huge opportunity to advance a positive future, a strategic opportunity to send economic signals that shape the marketplace particularly because their purchasing is professionally managed by a purchasing officer or even an entire purchasing department. But institutional purchasers and the professionals that manage their purchasing currently face challenges in realizing this strategic opportunity. First, institutional purchasers do not send coordinated signals into the marketplace. They tend to be creating their own individual sustainable purchasing or green purchasing programs. And second, procurement professionals lack access to a consistent set of resources that could help them to navigate this landscape and encourage coordination. As a result, suppliers are faced with a barrage of similar but different market signals in the form of surveys, checklists, and specifications that they receive from their customers. And these different requests also reference an increasingly diverse array of similar but different eco-labels, standards, and certifications in the marketplace. The founders of the SPLC came together to ask the blue sky question that addresses this challenge. Could we collaborate as leadership organizations to launch a shared program for guiding, measuring, and recognizing leadership in sustainable purchasing? We've brought together a collaborative community to develop a consistent set of resources that will enable the entire community of leadership organizations to send consistent market signals to advance sustainability and mission objectives. Our timeline has been pretty fast. We launched in July 2013. In August, we brought together a founders circle of leadership organizations that were willing to provide financial and technical support for the launch of the council. And we engaged a number of strategic partners with whose work our vision is aligned, and we're continuing to expand those partnerships. Also in August, we held a 2013 founding summit to lay out a work plan for the next 18 months. We launched a website the following month and then opened for membership in October 2013. By now, we've grown to a membership of more than 130 government, corporate, NGO, and academic organizations, and we are adding new members every month. We then created a technical advisory group of representatives from the initial group of members to develop a set of principles for leadership in sustainable purchasing that would act as a resource for institutional purchasers and also act as a compass for the work of the council. And according to the principles, a purchasing organization demonstrates leadership in sustainable purchasing through understanding the relative impact of its purchasing, committing to actions to take responsibility for those impacts, delivering results against those commitments, and in the process, promoting innovation and transparency in the marketplace to advance a positive future. The principles are introduced and explained in a 16-page document that can be downloaded from our website. They are primarily intended as a guidance document for institutional purchasers, and the document includes an explanation and representative actions for each of these 5 principles from the perspective of an institutional purchaser. But the document also includes interpretations for other stakeholders who are in a position to support leadership in sustainable purchasing, including suppliers of goods and services, standards and certifications developers, and public interest advocates. Moving on in the timeline, we then held our 2014 summit organized around those principles and used that meeting to begin the work of setting up program committees, including a technical advisory committee and technical advisory groups. And Larry has been kind enough to sit on one of those groups, so we're grateful for his participation. To start work, and those program committees then started work on creating our second major deliverable, our guidance for leadership in sustainable purchasing version 1.0. And I'm very pleased to announce that after working with over 100 volunteers like Larry, and Joel and his colleagues have also kindly given input on this process, over 100 volunteers on the Technical Advisory Committee of TAGs have worked over the past 6 to 7 months to create a 200-page guidance document, which will be released tomorrow in a launch webinar. The link is there on your screen. And we invite all of you to attend and also download a copy. The guidance is intended as a step-by-step guide to help organizations to improve environmental, social, and economic performance within their supply chains by implementing a strategic sustainable purchasing program. And with the launch of the guidance, we will immediately begin starting to pilot the guidance with a group of organizations that have volunteered to help us test its applicability for a range of types and sizes of purchasing organizations. So if you're interested in participating or getting engaged in the pilot, please attend the webinar tomorrow. We already have over 80 organizations signed up for the pilot. We would welcome more participants, I'm showing you just one of the pages from the guidance that highlights probably the most important concept in our work, which is the concept of prioritization. Our job, as we see it, is to help large organizations to prioritize their actions in order to be strategic in the use of their purchasing influence to advance broad societal sustainability objectives and also their own organizational mission objectives. The guidance also provides general information about how to create and run an effective, strategic, sustainable purchasing program. And it also provides specific guidance on 8 priority categories of purchasing, including chemically intensive products. And this is certainly a nice opportunity to thank Larry for his participation on this tactical advisory group, and also to thank Joel and GC3 for his participation on our strategic advisory committee, which helps to guide the strategic direction of the council as a whole. Moving forward in the timeline, on May 27th to 28th, we will host our 2015 summit in Seattle, where many of the sessions will focus on specific aspects of the guidance, and we will hear back from pilot participants on their experiences. We'll also be making our first case study awards for leadership in sustainable purchasing, and we will be supporting a side event called SPLC Connect, which is a buyer-supplier matchmaking event. We've extended the early bird registration deadline to Friday of this week, so I hope that some of you will consider attending. Based on the results of the pilot and input at the 2015 summit, we will begin adapting the principles and guidance into a rating system for recognizing organizations for institutional leadership in sustainable purchasing. So I hope some of you will consider tuning in for the guidance launch tomorrow, attending the 2015 summit in May in Seattle, and becoming part of the conversation that we are convening around leadership in sustainable purchasing. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason, for that broad overview. We'll continue on. So let me welcome Rob Kaplan from Walmart. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, everybody, for calling in today and listening to us. It's really a pleasure to be able to share some of Walmart's journey in this world of engaging our buyers in sustainability and how can we do that most effectively. So I'm just going to speak for about 10 minutes or so on how Walmart has approached this challenge and some of our key initiatives in there, and then how we're driving incentives as well. So as many of you know, Walmart is the world's largest retailer. We operate in a couple dozen different countries globally. And it makes this idea of engaging in sustainability quite complicated when you get down to the purchasing and product level. Overall, Walmart is a purpose-driven company. It's on our, pretty much every building that we have that our goal is to save people money so they can live better. It's what Sam Walton set out over 50 years ago, just over 50 years ago, and has turned the company into Fortune 1 in that less than 50 years. But when you apply that idea of save money, live better to sustainability, there's kind of a couple key philosophical points that I think are important to point out. We don't believe that our customers should have to choose between sustainability and affordability. Just like they shouldn't have to choose between sustainability and safe or affordability and safe or affordability and healthy. And that's really our role as a retailer, is to bring that choice to the customer. But it also means that in the sort of cutthroat and highly competitive world of consumer retailing, that if there is a big business value to this for us. It's not a philanthropic endeavor. And in fact, if it doesn't pay, then it's not sustainable for us, in both senses of the word. That's really how we look at sustainability. It has to have both a business and an environmental benefit to us and the system overall. So Walmart has 3 aspirational sustainability goals: to create zero waste, to be powered 100% by renewable energy, and to buy and sell sustainable products. The first 2, waste and energy, are where we started our journey about 7 or 8, even 10 years ago now. And it's really about our direct operations, our stores, our distribution centers, the electricity used to power them, and the waste coming out of the back of them. And a lot of that focus was, if we're going to be working on sustainability, we have to get our own house in order. And we've been very successful in those areas. We're the largest owner-operator of solar power in the country now, and in many of the countries we operate. And globally, we are very close to our 100% landfill diverted goal. But the third pillar of our sustainability strategy, buying and selling sustainable products, has been where we've really focused our efforts over the last few years because it's so much more complicated and difficult and involves the full supply chain. There are I'll talk about 2 projects that we've leveraged in that space to help us get to that aspirational goal. But before I do, I just want to talk a little bit about how we're structured and what we mean when we say buyer or merchant at Walmart. So at Walmart, in Walmart US, just to make it simpler, we'll talk about just the United States operations. There's a group of individuals at the company called merchants, and sometimes they're used interchangeably to be described as buyers. And merchants, there are several hundred of them. They are responsible for choosing what goes on the shelf in any given store. Now, there's another division called operations that actually puts those items on the shelf and operates the stores and makes them clean and makes sure the items are there for when customers walk in. But it's the merchants that have most of the power around what goes on the shelf. And they are empowered to really be CEOs of their own little business. So there is a banana buyer, there is a laptop buyer, there is a household cleaning buyer. And it really is kind of structured like you would imagine as you walk into the store. There's a buyer, if you walk into the household cleaning aisle, you know, there's a buyer for laundry detergent, and there's a buyer for surface cleaners, and there's a buyer for dishwashing soap. And they ladder up to a director who oversees pretty much the whole aisle, and then there's a VP or an SVP over all of that division. And then it ultimately rolls up to 3 key merchant leaders. There's a executive vice president for consumables, an executive vice president for food, and an executive vice president for general merchandise and apparel, which is pretty much everything else. And so there really we're talking about a few hundred individuals that we're really trying to influence. And as we think about executing that goal, it is recognizing that our objective is to integrate sustainability into those individuals' everyday business. As we work separately as a sustainability group, the real influence we have is through the merchandising group. And so how do we empower them to own sustainability? There's a couple important things to just note about how those folks operate. One is that they're incredibly busy. They don't have a lot of free time. They're managing multi-billion-dollar businesses every day. And sustainability isn't going to help them meet their, whatever multi-billion-dollar challenge they're facing. So they have limited time. And the other thing is that there's a perception around the power that those individuals have, and then there's a reality around the power those individuals have. And certainly they have a lot of influence, and they work with major corporations and CEOs of major corporations on a daily basis to make sure that we're meeting the business objectives that we have together. But they don't get to tell those companies and those suppliers what to do. It's a common myth, actually, that that's how it works. It really is a partnership for how we're going to deliver the best result for our customer. And that's where the buyer really views their role, is to be the champion of the customer. They represent what's the best interest of the customer, because that's what's going to make them buy those products and come back to Walmart in another time. So as we've thought about those challenges and those realities, there's 2 initiatives that I want to briefly touch on. The first is the Sustainability Index, which is our retail scorecarding program. It's a commitment we made in 2009. It has 3 sort of phases. The first was, let's get the science right. What is important for sustainability in any given category? The second is, let's make that science relevant to our buyers. And that's become the scorecard that I mentioned. And the third phase, which I'll talk a little bit about, is how do we engage our customers and make that information relevant to the customer as well. As we've gone down the first phase of that, around the science and getting the science right, we've partnered with an organization called the Sustainability Consortium. They're an academic group and multi-stakeholder group. And what they do is they look at peer-reviewed science and research out there and work through a multi-stakeholder process of NGOs and suppliers and trade groups to say, so what is really important from a sustainability perspective in any given category? So what's important is, for bananas, is certainly different than laptops. So let's develop some kind of materiality or prioritization process. And then the second piece is to then say, well, if we were to measure a company's performance against that issue or hotspot, as they call it, how would we do that? And that's what creates the questions that powers our sustainability index scorecard. So we've really partnered with an outside organization to create that information for us. The reason we focus it at the category level is really important. We've, in the past, done different levels of data collection. We've looked at the item level for packaging. We've looked at the supplier level overall. And we found that the supplier level is too vague to get into real actionable information. And the item level is too detailed and too much information to also become actionable. So what we found is that category is really the optimal way for us to engage our business. There's a key balance around collecting data for the sake of it and actually stuff that you can use and that merchants can use. So it's often easy for folks to say, well, why don't we just ask a lot more questions of our suppliers and make them answer those questions? And we can do it, but it's not really that helpful to anybody if we can't use the results. So we're very focused on making sure if we are asking questions of suppliers and collecting data and information, that we have a clear purpose for how we're going to use it. The second key element that we've talked about in this area is something called our sustainable chemistry policy. So while we have a scorecard that allows suppliers to be ranked on a 100-point scale and buyers to be able to access that information and see at the category level how they're performing on a 100-point scale, we also have a chemicals policy where we've set clear expectations about what we would like to see in the products we buy across the board around transparency and improved formulation. And that's a slightly different tactic where it's a little bit more of setting the floor rather than incentivizing and scoring. So that's an initiative that we launched about a year ago and have been continuing to work on partnering with our suppliers to figure out how we will meet those expectations. And I just want to close by saying that in terms of incentives, Walmart has asked every buyer or merchant, so of those several hundred folks, to create an annual goal as part of their performance evaluation around sustainability and responsibility. This has been an interesting challenge for us as a sustainability team as to how do you influence that? What does a good goal look like at an individual buyer or merchant level? And how do we hold folks accountable for that? And that's been an iteration over the last couple of years, but the reality is that every buyer has to set a goal in sustainability or responsibility, and their annual evaluation, they have to talk to their supervisor about it, and they have to be able to record in their eval how they did. And that's really created a lot of focus for us and ability to incentivize merchants. But, you know, they're going to make a lot more success in their performance eval if they make their numbers. Sustainability is always going to be kind of an additional part of that. Of course, the ultimate incentive for buyers is customer engagement. If the customer wants this, whatever it is, the buyers will react to it. It goes back to what I talked about earlier, is that they view themselves as the voice of the customer. And if they think that these products will perform better because customers really will buy them, that will drive ultimate change in the supply chain. And really, that's where the power resides. With that, I'll close it off and turn it over to the next speaker and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. With that, let's pass to Larry Garcia from Seattle City Lights. Welcome, Larry, to today's webinar.
Okay, thanks, Joel, and thank you all. So our communications folks would like me to start off with a little bit about who we are. We are the electric power company for the city of Seattle, Seattle City Light. We're a fairly heavy industrial operation, and we are a large buyer of materials. So typically not bananas, but we may be buying transformers or many coating materials. The operation itself, we'd like to mention that we've been greenhouse gas neutral since 2005. And we started doing some work trying to reduce our energy loads in the 1970s. So we haven't had to build new power plants because we've just been decreasing demand instead. So I'd like to start off with Rachel Carson. It's a pretty straightforward item that we do find chemicals all around us. So every human being now is subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death. That is just as true today, sadly enough, as it was back when she wrote that. So we look at products that we're using, and we are a major buyer of materials. We operate wastewater and water treatment plants. We operate 6 hydroelectric power plants. We build bridges that can hold logging trucks. we use chemicals, and we view highly toxic products, something that will increase the chance of our workers coming down with Parkinson's disease, or something that could kill off the salmon that swim in the rivers that our dams are operated on, as faulty products. So long ago, about in the late 80s, early 90s, we started a chemical use reduction policy. It was formalized into a departmental policy and procedure in 2003, and we have policies on how to move utility poles from one spot to another. So these are items that are actually a departmental policy. Our superintendent signs off on them. And it's incredibly important to have leadership from the top if you're going through and trying to find some kind of a chemical use reduction. How do we avoid bringing products in that we really don't want to be working with? And so the purpose on this DPP was simply to reduce our overall use of hazardous materials and to increase the use of less harmful alternatives. And so we set up a system where we actually evaluate the product itself, anything that we're actually going to be buying. And if it triggers some kind of a concern, and that's a value setting item we'll talk about a little bit later, we do an alternative assessment to see what other options are out there. And if there are no options, sometimes we have very expensive protocols for how to use materials that are highly hazardous to avoid exposing our workers or avoid exposing the public to these materials. So again, where we operate, in some cases we have facilities in the middle of a national park. So Thoreau is another great one to look at. What's the use of a house if we don't have a decent planet to put it on? So the policy we set up was fairly difficult at first. We tasked managers and workers to select the least hazardous chemical, which is a fairly stringent concern for anybody involved. We also set up worker right-to-know coordinators, so it's a labor and industries, health and safety type idea that you have to have material safety data sheets or safety data sheets for any chemical you're working with, and you need to train your workers on those products. So we have people in each work group that were worker right-to-know coordinators. And so if I'm looking for a new coating, if I'm looking for a new cleaning product, whatever my work group might be, I go to my worker right-to-know coordinator who gets training on how to read and interpret safety data sheets more than the average person typically. We really want somebody who can actually translate the information to the workers. You go to that person, and then you send this on to Health and Safety and Environmental Affairs, and we evaluate the product with a bit more expertise in certain areas. And so we started off with that. When the worker right-to-know coordinators, we've sort of dropped that idea. That was the initial rule that we had. It's a fairly significant demand when you start looking at very technical products in some areas. So we set up a chemical approval process instead. We have a chemical approval coordinator. The safety data sheet and other information, technical data sheets will show up at the chemical approval process coordinator's desk. That would be me. I got one this morning even. And we try to evaluate whether or not we want to work with a product. Are there some criteria to it, some ingredients that trigger a concern for us? So we send this in. We have a tiered hazard ranking system. It's similar to the green screen, where we have certain items that really do trigger a high rating of hazard and others that are a very low level of hazard. And a high hazard product, again, will trigger an alternative assessment. An alternative assessment run by somebody in environmental affairs is going to be a very weak alternative assessment. I need help from our engineering crews. I'll talk to our mechanical engineers if we're looking at changing an oil in a wicket gate. I can't just grab Wesson oil and pour it in and assume that it's going to work. I need to find something that actually meets the standards. We can't compromise electricity going out to our customers. It's really bad if the hospital loses power. So we need to make sure that whatever product we're using performs properly. I need to talk to the end users. Where are we going to use this product? I'll get a suggestion for a product, and what will happen from there is I go to the end user if this one is hazardous and find out how are we using it, where are we using it. So the hazard ranking is unfortunately somewhat value-based. How do I determine what really is going to trigger an alternative assessment? We're very concerned about aquatic toxicity, for example, since we operate in rivers with endangered salmon living in them. If our operation were in the middle of a desert with no water around it, aquatic toxicity might be a lower concern for me. So while there's really this wonderful, I have the same desire for a nice quantitative system where I have product X, and product X rates 84 on a scale of 100 for concern for me, or 24 out of 100. It's very difficult to do that. Where it's used in the facility makes a difference on whether or not we want to use the product? It's quite a bit. Let's see, I'm getting a few questions already. So how is the tiered hazard ranking mentioned by Larry similar to green screen? We can possibly look at this later. We have the same 4 tiered items, same 4 tiered categories. I'll have something in a little bit that'll be somewhat similar. We use a number of the same criteria. So if you're looking at what is carcinogenic, for example, I try to use the same criteria that green screen, although now with new information for global harmonization, I'm trying to figure out whether we stick with green screen or whether we go with global harmonization, how we actually determine what's going to meet the criteria now. So that's something I haven't worked on. Do I collect proprietary formula information? I contact manufacturers on a regular basis. SDSs are not always very detailed, so I do contact manufacturers and oftentimes just ask questions like, you've mentioned a non-ionic surfactant in your safety data sheet. Can you tell me, is that an alcohol ethoxylate? Is that an alkyl phenol ethoxylate? Even a general class of compound may be enough for me to determine if I have an issue with the product to start off with. So I do contact manufacturers, and since we're a potential buyer, they are oftentimes happier to talk with us than other groups. So some of our examples of criteria we established for hazard rankings, and the wording we use is exactly, use no carcinogens if safer alternatives exist, period. It's a powerful item. It allows me to say that, look, we have this option here. This is carcinogenic. We have another option available. So we are not using this one. We will use this other product. Use the least flammable option available. But how we exactly rate them against each other, that is a challenging item. So one of the easiest ways to deal with this is with contracting. I have the pleasure of working with the City of Seattle. We are a department in the city. And we have really talented people in green purchasing at the city operation also. And so we start focusing in on what do we buy in large quantities? Coatings, we buy in huge quantities. Office products, we buy huge numbers of office products, cleaning products. And so we looked at setting up green criteria in contracts. And we put a lot of the emphasis on our vendors, but we set up materials that we just do not want to have in our products. We spell those out in our contracts and say, look, we do not want to buy these ever. So persistent bioaccumulative toxins, we have a city standard even that says, look, we are going to avoid persistent bioaccumulative toxins. If they exist, we don't want them in our products. So we do this for commonly used products. It makes it much easier. Our coatings contract, I got a request from our paint crew chief recently. The nice water-based epoxy we've been using for the floors in our substations, the company that made it was purchased, and the product's no longer available. So he sent me a new product, our vendor contract. They submitted something. It's supposed to be a first choice to go to a more environmentally preferable product. He sent me the material. It's a nice water-based epoxy from a different manufacturer. Turns out it was Green Seal certified even. It was a very simple response. We've got our crews set up and our contract set up to sort of default and move towards a more environmentally preferable product. They're less expensive to handle. They're less expensive for disposal. We don't have to have quite the same concerns for our workers. We had one product a few years ago. We had proposed one product for a coating. I proposed an alternative because the first one was quite hazardous. The second one didn't work. Our paint crew chief thought it might work. We gave it a try. It didn't do what we needed it to do. So we ended up setting up a negative air enclosure, a nice plastic enclosure with negative air machines with carbon filters on it. We put our workers in supplied air. We evacuated the area of the power plant where they were working while they were using the product. That's very expensive to do. We'd much rather use a safer product and not have to do that. Now, some other items we've pursued and are working, and I know some of you probably envy this idea, but we've limited the purchasing power for our workers. So credit cards and also purchase orders. We can't purchase chemicals with them. It's not allowed. If I go out with a credit card, I don't even have a credit card. We have very few people who have them at the utility, thankfully. And I purchase a chemical for some reason, I won't get reimbursed for it, which is a real disincentive. I can go to our vendor contracts. Our vendor contracts are set up so that we can go to a vendor store and get a chemical product. They're set up to try to provide the most environmentally preferable option for us. And so what we're trying to do is adopt universal standards for our own operations. If we are doing a certain project, we use a certain material. A few of the other items we looked at, just purchasing the minimum amount needed, purchasing the amount of material for the job. because disposal costs are one of the big drivers for us. Pollution prevention was a big driver for this, and also product shelf life. If we buy too much of the product, it's really not going to work. So it's, again, education for the workforce that just because it's cheaper to buy a 55-gallon drum of the product doesn't mean it's the best option for us. In other cases that we look at, it's just not the chemical itself, but a process change. So having a nice little push can like those up there, fairly nice little item. You just wet a rag and you reduce your usage tremendously. Improving operations and maintenance. How are we actually doing the work? Changing the process. Doing some closed-loop recycling. Substituting materials is what we're focusing on today. But in a lot of cases, it may be something very different from just choosing the greenest product available. I mentioned before approval and hazard tiers. We have a system that does two things at once. One is it rates the hazard, and so this is the similarity of the green screen, where we've gone with tier 1 through 4, where tier 1, like in the green screen, is the highest hazard, with tier 4 being the lowest hazard. And we have an internal system of approval where either the chemical is just completely not approved, and that's typically a very high-level hazard, to a preferred product. WTO2, the state of Washington has something called a Washington Toxic, which is regulated in the state of Washington for disposal, but not other places. So we're trying to give guidance to our workers that, hey, this product may be preferred, but it also does qualify as a Washington Toxic, so we need to address it differently from a disposal perspective. So the characteristics, again, this is the value added aspect on it. What does qualify as a tier 1? How do we define what a carcinogen is? What's a persistent bioaccumulative toxin? We've gone beyond just the list of products that have been listed in regulations. We go with behavior. Is it persistent? Is it bioaccumulative? Is it toxic? If it meets the criteria, then it is. It doesn't have to be on some kind of a list. Anyway, so I'll leave it with this thought. And again, it's Rachel Carson again. I'll let you take a look at that one, and I will turn this back over to Joel.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry, and thank you to our three presenters for their talks, which frame in very different ways this question of how do we accelerate green chemistry through purchasing decisions. Let me just ask a broad question to the three of you to start off. We heard a little bit from Rob about some of the ways Walmart's incentivizing its buyers. What are the best what do you think are the best approaches that you've learned or seen that would help bring buyers more effectively into these discussions about safer chemicals? And are there approaches that just have not worked very well? What can we learn from what's been tried to date to engage the purchasing community or purchasers, buyers more effectively in these questions around green chemistry?
This is Rob. I have seen a lot of things not go well in this area. I think the guidance I would give in the way that we've approached it is imagine trying to talk to a customer walking into a Walmart store about this. That's the level of depth that you are able to get to with a buyer on it, for the most part. Anytime we go at a buyer with lots of statistics or science, it is a lost cause. And it's largely because it's not their job. Their job is not to be a scientist and to evaluate different types of information like that. So that's the more that we can simplify and help make it easy, the more successful we'll be.
Thank you for that question. And this actually is a significant challenge for any, as we term it, champion for sustainable purchasing within a large organization. And I think one way to what I want to do is point people to the guidance again that we're releasing tomorrow. And one section of that guidance is really aimed at the champion within a large organization who is seeking to build sustainability in a more robust way into decision-making in the organization. And we have tips that we provide to those champions for how to get buy-in from different types of stakeholders internally within the organization. One of those sets of tips is focused on appealing to purchasing staff. And probably the most important message that we would want to encourage champions to communicate is that there are ways in which sustainable purchasing can actually reduce the existing burdens that purchasing staff are operating under. They're often understaffed. They're often feeling, as Rob mentioned, very, very busy. And so the key is identifying ways that sustainable purchasing can actually reduce their burdens, and as I think Walmart, as what Rob demonstrated, has done a good job of building some rewards into the internal incentive structure for the purchasers. Other ideas that we suggest are highlighting the ways in which existing purchasing practices are already addressing sustainability objectives as a way to build internal buy-in, show how sustainable purchasing program can be more strategic than a contract-by-contract process, focusing on a reasonable scope to start out with, highlighting alignments between sustainable purchasing and what is often called strategic sourcing, which have some significant overlaps. And in doing so, we think it's possible to provide an opportunity for purchasing staff to become more strategic players internally within their organization through sustainable purchasing. And then, of course, providing examples of cost-saving and value-add opportunities, which will help purchasing staff to deliver on their existing performance measures. But there's more detail on a lot of that in the guidance itself. In fact, on page 25, if you download it tomorrow.
Great, thank you.
This is Larry. I've got one example, I guess, also. We have a small store that operates in one of our towns, and one of the items we sell fishing gear. And there are some concerns about small lead sinkers, for example, since they're a major cause of death for bald eagles, and we have currently about 200 bald eagles overwintering on our river. So I contacted the manufacturers of the products because there are Prop 65 warnings on so many of these items. If you sell anything in the state of California that has an item on the list of Prop 65 or could have it, you need to put a Prop 65 warning on there that it could be known in the state of California to cause cancer or reproductive hazards. And most of this gear had something on there. And my concern was small lead sinkers, we know kill loons, we know those kill bald eagles. And the company involved was not very happy initially. It's like, well, if you don't want anything with a Prop 65 warning on it, you probably don't want to be buying everything. And my concern was really, why is it there, is the key question. And so most of it was there because they had some brass. Some small lead sinkers we replaced with tungsten or steel shot. But for the brass items, the amount of lead is fairly small. The warning is there because there probably is lead there, and so to sell it in California, you have to have the warning on there. But there was resistance just from the operator from, you know, if you're going to ban everything with Prop 65 warnings on it, that's going to take care of pretty much everything that we sell.
Great, thank you. Rob, let me ask a follow-up question to you. Does Walmart do education to its buyers on its sustainability goals? And then secondarily, in this sort of first iteration of your buyers putting sustainability goals in their performance evaluations, have you learned anything from that process to date? Have any put in sustainable chemistry goals in their goals?
Yeah, we do. We have done trainings, particularly around the launch of the Sustainability Index a couple years ago. We did a series of in-person trainings, and they were, I would say, not as successful as we would like them to be. I mean, it ends up being a relatively dry topic. And for buyers to dedicate hours of time to playing with a tool and understanding it, it just is not really worth their investment. I mean, overall, you'll have some folks who are really interested in it, and they are your champions, and they are coming to you and asking for engagement. But the majority of buyers are, you know, recognize that it's a goal, know that they're supposed to do something. How do we make it easy for them? Just tell me what I need to, quote, go do. It's a big thing within our culture around what's my go do from this meeting, and let's cut to the chase. So we've taken that approach. We've learned also about that through our goal setting support. So as those goals have been set, our first year we were very hands-off. We sort of took to heart this idea of buyers should own their business and give them the tools and let them do what they want. And we just had moderate success with that. You know, folks weren't able to pay attention to it. They set lousy goals, or they set vague goals was probably a better way to describe it. And so we've now tried to figure out ways that we can have a more consistent process and sort of freedom within a framework. Another key part of how we focused it is through that hierarchy I described earlier is you really need goals that can ladder up. So if an executive vice president has a goal around sustainable chemistry, she needs to be able to allocate part of that goal to one of her direct reports and part to another, and then that cascades down to the merchant and buyer level. So being able to have goals that are quantifiable and can be cascaded has been a key part of how we move forward. Certainly, to your question around sustainable chemistry, we have engaged directly with all levels of merchandising around our sustainable chemistry policy and what work needs to be done this year to make sure that we're successful in meeting the expectations of the policy.
Here's another question for the three of you. In terms of thinking about the purchasing questions, how far up the supply chain do you look at these sustainable chemistry questions, or is it really with the direct product manufacturer you're purchasing from? Secondary question to that, which is, well, how do you when there is proprietary information, how do you address that's going through the supply chain?
Joel, this is Jason. I'll respond first because I probably have the least to say because it's early in our process. I would say, generally speaking, the Council would like to be encouraging purchasers to be encouraging their suppliers to be gaining access to supply chain information as far up the supply chain is necessary to be able to access what Rob referred to in his presentation as the hot spots that are likely the areas where the most significant risk exists or the most significant potential system damage, that is damage to nature or to society, is occurring in that supply chain. But we recognize, like everyone working in this space, that the information systems to gain access to that data are not necessarily yet in place. So as a future goal, we would like to be pushing the information request as far up the supply chain as necessary to get at those hotspots. But currently, our focus is on purchasers asking the right questions of the suppliers themselves with an eye toward setting up kind of transparency in supply chains that in the future would allow for questions to be asked as far up the supply chain as necessary to gain access to those hotspots.
Great, thanks. Rob, Larry, thoughts on that question?
Sure, this is Larry. So that's probably one of the weaker parts of our program, honestly. When we're looking at a product, it's typically for an immediate need. We are planning on doing some work and we need a product for that. So we're looking less at the green chemistry on what would be ideal for a product, but more of what are the available options for us today. And in that alternative assessment, we try to go as far up the chain as possible. Like, what are the ingredients? What are the adverse effects for manufacturing these products? It's not the simplest thing to do, and typically there is a timeline. So we have certain items that trigger an alternative assessment, and if nothing really triggers that, we're not looking at the supply chains in any detail at all, if there's nothing in there as an ingredient that really triggers an alternative assessment.
I would say, this is Rob, that information transparency is one of the biggest challenges we face in this particular supply chain because so much of how these products are made that end up in our store that have chemistries, there's so much proprietary and confidentiality built into that supply chain and those products that it's a huge challenge for us to achieve the results we want, because certainly we need to respect that confidentiality and proprietary information. So our work is directly with our direct suppliers. That's who our merchants work with. And so we have to recognize that if you have a meeting with a buyer and a chemical company, they're going to have no idea what to even talk about. Their worlds are so far removed. The reality is, they work with our direct suppliers, the brands that they bring these products to us, and we rely on them to work with their suppliers and so forth. We have started through groups like the Retail Leadership Council at GC3, which has been an amazing opportunity, as well as a group we've engaged with in collaboration with Target stores called through a Personal Care and Beauty Summit we held last year, a sort of more full value chain engagement where we look at how do we set expectations and help those further up the supply chain understand what we're trying to do and why information transparency is so important and what we're going to do with that information so that we can help accelerate that communication moving forward.
Great, thank you. Let me ask just one more question of the three of you. If you were to take an important lesson or that you had from your own experience, and you had a retailer coming to you saying, we want to start a sustainable chemistry program, we want to bring this to our merchants or our buyers, what would be the 2 to 3 things you'd tell us we should start with? What do we need to know to start this program? What are your biggest lessons that we could put forward going forward in this direction? Why don't you start, Jason?
I would just have one message, which was do not try to do it alone. Reach out to other retailers, engage with organizations like the Sustainability Consortium that has been working extensively with Walmart and other retailers. Reach out to the GC3, that is, reach out to those entities that are already bringing together the knowledge and understanding to provide that guidance, and become a part of the communities of practice or the community of practice that is most appropriate to the questions that you're asking. Because I think the more that organizations are coming together in communities of practice around shared questions, the more effectively they will be able to address those questions.
I would echo that comment by just saying stakeholder engagement is so important in this type of process. I'd say that through the development of our sustainable chemistry policy, we probably did more stakeholder engagement with the full supply chain than in any other initiative we have leveraged and launched. And still, to that point, it was extremely controversial and not well received by our partners. So the more you can communicate about what you're trying to do and why, the more transparent you can be, the more successful. And also, I'd say, just echoing some of the comments I made earlier about just recognizing your place as the retailer, what is really your role in this conversation, and how can we help? That's often misunderstood.
And finally, Larry, your thoughts?
Sure. I would say pick a category of products that you purchase and focus in on one item to start off with, whether that is office supplies or whether you're talking about coatings or cleaning products. And focus in on one item and try to green one area, start small. And also, why are you doing this? For us, we may have children on tour boats, so using a cleaning agent that might trigger an asthma attack is a really unpleasant idea for us. So why are you doing this, and why are you choosing this particular group? Is it because you've purchased an awful lot of it, or because you have a risk that is built into that product line?
And with that, I want to thank Jason, Rob, and Larry again for really informative and thoughtful presentations, which will certainly help get a lot of discussion going. So thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.